The morning after my father's funeral, I found a letter hidden inside a book he had never allowed anyone to touch. And the strangest part wasn't the letter itself. It was the name written across the front. It wasn't mine, it wasn't my mother's, and it wasn't the name of anyone I recognized. It simply said, "For Daniel, when he finally comes looking." I stood in my father's study, holding that envelope for almost 10 minutes, trying to understand who Daniel was and why my father had been waiting for him. My father had died at 71 after a long illness, and during the final months of his life, he rarely spoke about his past. But whenever I asked about the old years, he would tell me that some things were better left buried. I had assumed he was talking about his failed business, the lawsuits that followed, and the people who had turned against him. I never imagined he had been hiding an entire person from me. The book was an old leather-bound journal that had belonged to my grandfather. My father had kept it locked in a glass cabinet for as long as I could remember, and after his death, the lawyer told me I could finally take whatever I wanted from the study. I opened the letter expecting an explanation, but instead I found a photograph of a young boy standing beside my father. The boy looked about 10 years old. My father was much younger in the photograph, perhaps 35, and his hand was resting on the boy's shoulder. On the back, he had written, "He doesn't know who he really is." Beneath that sentence was another line that made my stomach tighten. "If they find him before you do, everything ends." I immediately called my father's lawyer and asked him about Daniel. He went silent for several seconds before asking me where I had found the letter. When I told him, he said, "Put it back." I asked why. He said, "Because your father didn't want you to know about Daniel unless something happened to him." I reminded him that my father was already dead. The lawyer replied, "That's exactly why I'm worried." Then he asked whether I had opened the letter. I said yes. He told me to leave the house immediately and go somewhere public. Before I could ask another question, the call ended. I looked toward the study window and noticed a black sedan parked across the street. I had never seen it before. The driver was sitting perfectly still, watching my father's house. Then my phone received a message from an unknown number. "Don't look for Daniel." I stared at the screen, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I realized that someone already knew I had found the letter. I left the house through the garage and drove directly to a hotel on the other side of town. I kept checking my mirrors, but the black sedan was gone. I tried to convince myself that whoever had sent the message was simply trying to frighten me, but I couldn't ignore the timing. My father had been dead for less than 24 hours, and someone already knew about a letter hidden inside his study. I spent the afternoon studying the photograph. The boy had dark hair, brown eyes, and a small scar above his left eyebrow. My father had written a date on the back, 18 years earlier. I searched through our old family records and discovered something strange. The photograph had been taken only 3 months after my parents' divorce, yet according to everything I knew, my father had spent those years alone. Then I noticed something in the background. Behind my father and the boy stood a red brick building with a large clock mounted above the entrance. I recognized it as an old children's rehabilitation center that had closed almost 20 years earlier. I searched through the building's records and discovered that my father had donated money to the center every month for 12 years. The donations stopped suddenly on the exact date written on the photograph. I contacted a former employee who still lived nearby, and she agreed to meet me. The moment I showed her the photograph, she recognized my father. But when I asked about the boy, her expression changed. She looked at the photograph again before quietly saying, "That boy wasn't a patient." I asked what she meant, and she explained that the rehabilitation center had been used for more than medical treatment. Certain wealthy families had paid to keep private records there, especially records involving children whose identities they wanted hidden. She refused to explain anything more, but before we parted, she handed me an old key. She told me my father had left it there years ago, and had given strict instructions that it should never be handed to anyone unless his son came looking for it. When I asked what the key opened, she admitted that my father had never told her. That night, I returned to the abandoned rehabilitation center with the key. The building was surrounded by weeds and broken fencing, and most of the windows were covered in dust, but one side door still had a functioning lock. The key opened it. Inside, the corridors were dark and silent, but several rooms looked as though someone had been inside recently. I found an old records room and began searching through the cabinets. After nearly an hour, I discovered a folder marked with my father's initials. My hands started shaking when I opened it. Inside was a birth certificate, but it wasn't mine. It belonged to Daniel. I stared at the document, barely able to process what I was seeing. The father's name was listed as my father, but the mother's name had been left blank. For years, I had believed I was my father's only child. I had spent my entire life thinking I knew the people in my family and the secrets they kept. Now, I was holding proof that my father had hidden an entire person from me. Daniel wasn't a stranger. He was my father's son, my brother, and if the birth certificate was real, then my father had kept him hidden from me for 18 years. Suddenly, the anonymous message made sense. Someone didn't want me looking for Daniel because they knew exactly what I would find if I did. The photograph wasn't simply a clue about a forgotten child. It was evidence that my father had been protecting a secret for nearly 2 decades. And as I looked at the birth certificate again, one question became impossible to ignore. Why would my father hide his own son from the rest of his family? I read the rest of my mother's letter in silence. She admitted that she had known about Daniel from the beginning. She had discovered that my father was secretly protecting him and became convinced that Daniel was dangerous because of his connection to the missing financial records. She tried to convince my father to send him away, but he refused. Eventually, she contacted one of the executives involved in the financial scheme and told him where Daniel was living. She believed she was protecting our family from someone who might expose them and destroy everything my father had built. But then the letter took a different turn. My mother admitted that she had been manipulated. The executive had convinced her that Daniel was responsible for his mother's disappearance and had made her believe that my father was protecting a dangerous person. Later, she discovered the truth, but by then it was too late. Daniel had already disappeared. My mother spent the rest of her life trying to find him, and her letter ended with a sentence that stayed with me. Your father never forgave me, but he never stopped loving me. I looked at Daniel, and I could see the tears in his eyes. I asked whether he had known about the letter, but he said he hadn't. Then he told me something that made the entire situation even more confusing. My father wasn't the person who hid me. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation. He showed me an old photograph taken at the rehabilitation center. In the background stood a woman outside the building. Daniel identified her as Margaret Cole, my father's former secretary, who had disappeared shortly after my father's company collapsed. According to Daniel, she had secretly protected him after my father was forced to stop. We eventually tracked Margaret to a small town several hours away. When we found her, she refused to let us inside. She told us that Daniel's existence had never been a secret to everyone. It had only been a secret from me. My father had deliberately kept Daniel hidden because he believed I would eventually become a target. Then Margaret told me something that completely changed how I understood my father. Your father didn't hide Daniel from you because he didn't trust you. She looked directly at me and continued. He hid Daniel because he didn't trust himself. I asked what she meant, and she explained that my father had discovered someone close to him was manipulating his decisions. Someone had been feeding him false information for years, convincing him that Daniel was dangerous and that keeping him hidden was the only way to protect the family. That same person had convinced my mother that Daniel was responsible for his own mother's disappearance. I suddenly realized that almost every decision my family had made over the previous 18 years had been influenced by someone none of us had recognized. Margaret then handed me a folder containing a list of payments made to that person. I opened it and saw a name I recognized immediately. It was my father's lawyer, the same lawyer who had told me to put the letter back, the same man who had warned me not to look for Daniel. For 18 years, he had been controlling the story from behind the scenes. He had manipulated my father, deceived my mother, and kept Daniel hidden while making sure I never learned the truth. Suddenly, the photograph, the anonymous warnings, the hidden records, and the people who had been watching my family all made sense. The mystery wasn't simply about a secret brother. It was about someone who had spent 18 years controlling what my family believed was true. And now that I had finally found the person behind it, I knew he would do anything to keep me from discovering why he had gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep Daniel hidden. I called the lawyer and told him I had found Daniel, but he didn't sound surprised. Instead, he asked whether Daniel had shown me the documents. When I said yes, he sighed and said, "Then your father failed." I asked what he meant, and he explained that my father had spent years trying to protect me from a secret that could destroy our family. I told him the secret was already out, but he replied, "No, you still don't know who Daniel really is." He refused to explain over the phone, and instead asked me to meet him at my father's old company headquarters. I went alone. The building had been empty for years, but the lawyer still had access. He led me into my father's former office and opened a hidden compartment behind the desk. Inside was another box. He placed it on the table and told me my father had instructed him to give it to me only after I met Daniel. Inside was a videotape of my father sitting in that same office years earlier. When I played it, he looked directly into the camera and said, "If you're watching this, then Daniel has found you." I looked at Daniel, who was standing behind me. My father continued, "You will probably believe Daniel is your brother." Then he paused before saying, "He is." Daniel and I both froze. My father went on to explain the reason for all the deception. Daniel wasn't simply his son. He was also the legal heir to a company trust containing millions of dollars and evidence against the people who had destroyed my father's business. My father had placed the trust in Daniel's name because he believed I was being watched, but someone had eventually discovered that the trust existed and had spent years trying to locate Daniel. To protect him, my father had created a false story suggesting that Daniel was dangerous, hoping the people searching for him would stop looking in the right places. Then the lawyer interrupted the recording and told me my father had never intended for me to find the trust. I asked why, and he opened another folder containing financial records showing that my father had secretly transferred ownership of several properties into my name. I couldn't understand why he had done that. The lawyer explained that if Daniel was ever found, the people hunting him would come after me first. The properties were bait. My father had made me the visible heir so Daniel could remain hidden. Then the lawyer told me something I wasn't prepared for. My father had known I would eventually discover the truth. When I asked how, he reminded me of the letter. I told him the letter had been addressed to Daniel, but he smiled and said, "Exactly." That was when I finally understood. The letter wasn't really meant for Daniel. It was meant to lead me to him. My father had created the entire chain: the photograph, the hidden key, the rehabilitation center, the property records, even the lawyer's warnings. Everything had been designed to bring Daniel and me together. But one question remained. Why now? Why had the letter appeared immediately after my father's death? The lawyer looked at me and said, "Because the people your father was hiding Daniel from finally found him." That night, Daniel and I left the company building and drove to a safe apartment Margaret had arranged. We thought we finally understood the plan, but then Daniel opened the financial records again and noticed something I had missed. Every transfer connected to the trust had been made after my father's death. Someone had been managing the account remotely for years. That meant my father wasn't controlling the money anymore. Someone else had access. We contacted the bank and requested the transaction history. The banker found several transfers to an offshore account, and although the recipient's identity was hidden, the dates matched major events in our family: the death of my mother, Daniel's disappearance, my father's illness, and even the sale of the company. Someone had been moving money whenever something significant happened to us. Then the banker identified the institution receiving the transfers: a private foundation belonging to my father's lawyer. I felt betrayed. The lawyer had access to every document, every property, every trust, and every secret. I called him and asked if he had stolen from my father. He said no. When I asked who had been receiving the money, he answered, "Your father." I reminded him that my father was dead, but he replied, "Exactly." He explained that my father had created automatic transfers designed to keep the people hunting Daniel, convinced that the trust was still active. The lawyer had only been moving the money according to my father's instructions, but there was one transfer he hadn't authorized, a payment made 3 months before my father's death that had gone to an account belonging to someone inside our family. We traced the account to my mother's brother, my uncle, the relative everyone had always described as harmless and distant from the business. But the records showed that he had received millions. Daniel looked at the payment and said, "Your father was looking for the wrong trader." The payment date was the same day my father had changed his will. That meant my father had discovered the betrayal and changed his will to protect Daniel, but someone had found out. We drove to my uncle's old property, but the house was empty. Inside, however, we found photographs of my father, my mother, Daniel, and me. Someone had been following all of us. Then I found a recent photograph showing Daniel standing outside the rehabilitation center. The photograph had been taken only 3 days earlier. Daniel stared at it and said, "I wasn't there 3 days ago." Someone had been impersonating him. And whoever it was had access to our entire investigation. They knew where we were going, they knew what we had discovered, and they wanted us to believe Daniel was the target. But as I stared at the photograph, A more frightening possibility occurred to me. Perhaps Daniel wasn't the target at all. Perhaps I was. We returned to the safe apartment, only to discover that someone had already been inside. Nothing had been stolen, but the letter from my father was gone. In its place was another photograph showing my father standing with my uncle outside the old rehabilitation center. On the back were 3 words. Ask him why. I called my uncle, and this time he answered. He told me to come alone. When I arrived at an empty restaurant, I found him sitting in a corner booth looking exhausted and, for the first time, genuinely afraid. I asked why he had received the money, and he insisted he hadn't betrayed my father. He had been paying someone. When I asked who, he answered, "Your father." I told him that was impossible, but he explained that my father had been blackmailing someone inside the organization and needed money to keep Daniel protected. Then my uncle revealed something I never expected. Daniel wasn't the only child my father had hidden. There was another, a daughter. My father had discovered that the organization was using families to hide ownership of businesses and financial assets, and he had secretly helped several children disappear from their records. Daniel was only one of them. The girl was someone I actually knew, someone who had been around our family for years. Her name was Claire, my childhood babysitter. I remembered her clearly, but she had disappeared when I was 13. My uncle told me she had been moved after someone discovered her connection to my father. When I asked where she was now, he said he didn't know. Then he handed me a photograph of Claire as an adult, standing beside my father and the lawyer. Suddenly, I understood why the lawyer had known so much. He wasn't simply protecting my father. He had been protecting the children. Then my uncle said something that completely changed the meaning of everything I thought I knew. Your father didn't create the plan. I asked who had, and he looked at me before answering, your mother. I couldn't believe it. He explained that my mother had discovered the financial network before my father did. She had created the first hidden accounts, the properties, and the false identities. My father eventually joined her, but she had been the architect while he became the face of the operation. I immediately remembered my mother's letter, the one where she admitted she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe she hadn't been confessing to betrayal at all. Maybe she had deliberately allowed everyone to believe she was guilty. I returned to her old house and searched the study again. Behind a framed photograph, I found another hidden compartment containing a recording. My mother's voice came through the speaker. If my son ever finds this, he must understand one thing. There was a long pause before she continued. Your father didn't hide Daniel from you. Then she whispered the words that stopped me cold. I did. The recording ended with one final sentence. My reason is the only thing that can still save you. The recording contained a location, the same rural house shown in the photograph. I drove there with Daniel, and when we arrived, the house appeared completely empty, but the front door was unlocked. Inside was a table with 2 chairs and 2 envelopes waiting on top, one with my name and the other with Daniel's. We opened them together. My mother's letter finally explained everything. She had known the organization would eventually find Daniel, but she also knew they would come after me because of my father's trust. So she created a false story. She made Daniel believe he had been abandoned, made me believe I was an only child, made the organization believe Daniel had disappeared, and made everyone believe she was protecting only herself. But she had never stopped protecting us. Years earlier, when I was 12, someone had tried to take me from school. My mother stopped them and discovered that the person responsible was connected to the organization. From that moment on, she realized that keeping Daniel close to me would make both of us easier to find, so she separated us. She watched over me from a distance, protected Daniel from another, and waited for the day the organization would finally begin to collapse. Then we found a final photograph. It showed my mother standing between Daniel and me, but it wasn't an old photograph. It had been taken recently, very recently. I looked at Daniel, completely confused, and then a door opened behind us. My mother stepped into the room. She was alive. I couldn't move. Daniel stared at her in disbelief as she looked at both of us and simply said, "I'm sorry." I asked how she could possibly be alive when we had buried her. She explained that the woman who died wasn't her. It had been someone who looked enough like her to fool the people watching her. My mother had staged her death because the organization had finally discovered where Daniel was, and she had disappeared to draw them away. Now she had returned because the final stage of my father's plan was beginning. I asked what that final stage was, and she looked first at Daniel, then at me. Finding the person who has been controlling all of this. I asked who it was. but she didn't answer. Instead, she handed me one final photograph. It showed my father, my mother, Daniel, my uncle, the lawyer, Claire, and one other person. I recognized him immediately. The man who had been standing across the street in the first photograph. The man everyone believed had died 21 years earlier. My mother looked at me and said, "He's alive." I asked where he was, and she turned toward the window. "He's been watching this house tonight." I looked outside and saw a man standing beside a black sedan beneath the trees. He wasn't running or hiding. He was simply watching us. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number had sent one final message. "Now you know why your father never told you the truth." I looked at my mother. She was crying. Daniel stepped toward the window, but the man outside disappeared into the darkness. And suddenly, I understood something that frightened me more than anything else. My father's letter hadn't started this investigation. My mother's death hadn't started it either. Someone had been guiding us toward this house from the beginning, and whoever had been waiting outside already knew exactly what we were going to find next. Then the door behind us slowly opened again, but this time, none of us turned around.